Yeah, gross. Like I must transition immediately to destroy the white race, I guess. Anyway. Hello, everyone. I am Talia Bhatt, your resident gender binarist, transmedicalist, transsexual woman.
Hi. I'm Emma, a transmedicalist cis woman interloper who shouldn't be here.
Mhm.
And today we also have a guest. Would you introduce yourself,
Yeah.
Julia?
Sure. I'm Julia Serano, and I am a transsexual feminist who doesn't remember her D&D alignments all that well, but let's call me chaotic evil for the purpose of this podcast.
Beautiful,
Excellent.
amazing. I mean, you're on this podcast with us right now, so you're some flavor of evil. We can figure out the exact details over the course of the recording. So today, we are talking about a topic that is very near and dear to me because I have talked about it so many times over and over again in a variety of arenas and mediums. Initially, I started talking about it in Twitter threads, just screaming my head off regularly to everyone who would listen until I finally got my act together enough to compose a very large, very in-depth, very angry essay called The Third Sex, which I think might be my most like widely read and widely shared work. It's about anthropology and it's about orientalism and it's about the Western Academy. And it's about the idea of non-Western societies having non-binary understandings of gender, non-Eurocentric, non-binary understandings of gender, where we have all of these special communities of third genders who defy the patriarchy and live happy post-gender lives. And as the story has it, India apparently has one such community called the Hijra, who, well, we'll get into exactly what the Hijra are and what their genders are and all of this stuff in due time. But first, Julia, I'd like to ask you, so I've already talked at length about what the term third gender or third sex is and how much relevance it's had to my personal life and my work. So I'd like to ask, in what context did you encounter the term third sex and what relevance and meaning does it have to your life and work?
So I first came across those terms when I was doing research that ended up being for my 2007 book, Whipping Girl. And
Hmm.
to just give a little bit of background, kind of how I entered into this, I transitioned in 2001. But I had participated in trans communities, like the first time was about 1994, and that was
Hmm.
back during the time there is the transsexual, transvestite, or crossdresser divide.
Hmm.
So a lot of people tended to identify as one of those two things. But if in those situations when you'd get to know people and you'd just be talking, almost everybody felt like they didn't fall into either of those two groups, right?
Right, right.
And the thing that kind of helped me eventually reach a point, because I'm like, well, I can't be a transsexual because I'm attracted to women and all those other things, I don't hate my genitals or whatever. And so something that really helped me was the transgender movement started to gather momentum. And there are these books that you could buy by Kate
Hmm.
Bornstein and Leslie Feinberg and Ricky Wilchins, all of whom, which was very freeing for me, is that they
Hmm.
were all three of them are people who took steps to physically transition, but neither of them
Hmm.
identified fully within the binary, didn't have the term non-binary then, but
Hmm.
they would describe themselves as not men or not women, or they would the term genderqueer was popularized around that time. So I went into my transition identifying as genderqueer, and that kind of allowed me to like transition and just be like, okay, well, I'm me, I'm just going to transition and we'll see what happens. So anyway, this is in 2001. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area at this point. And so
Hmm.
I start becoming involved in trans communities here and greater, cisgender queer aspects of the community as well. And so
Hmm.
I encountered a couple different things that led me to write Whipping Girl. And so one, the thing that a lot of people most associate with Whipping Girl is I was noticing that a lot of the anti-trans sentiment that I experienced was very strongly steeped in misogyny. Um,
Yeah.
and so that ended up so I coined the term transmisogyny and I introduced that concept in the book. And so that was something that I experienced transmisogyny both in the straight mainstream, but also in queer communities. And then the other one, which was kind of, I found to be pretty much bizarre, was there was this sentiment at the time where, people were really into shattering the gender binary and, trans people were
Mm,
somewhat celebrated within the greater queer community for, basically not being in one or the other box, right?
right.
So much so that I would later, I think in my second book, Excluded, I put this term in. I didn't put it in Whipping Girl. I use the term, and you'll probably appreciate this nod to
Uh-huh.
Adrian Rich. I refer to it as compulsory genderqueerness, which was this idea
Mm,
that, like, within those communities, that as long as you were like actively breaking the gender binary, people thought it was cool. But the worst thing you could be is a transsexual. And if you did take steps to transition, you had to at least not call yourself a man or a woman. And so if you did, God forbid if you did that, then you would get these weird accusations where people would say, well, transsexuals are reinforcing the gender binary, or it's an inherently conservative gender, which seemed very weird to me because obviously in the straight mainstream world, when I came out to people's trans, no one was like, oh, thank you, Julia, for reinforcing the gender binary. We really appreciate that, right? You're doing such good work holding up our gender binary. And so, anyway, and this was a lot of why at the time, but there's a reason why the subtitle of Whipping Girl, I specifically refer to myself not just as a trans woman, but as a transsexual woman. And I
mhm,
very
mhm,
much want to write from a transsexual standpoint and talk about, well, actually, from my point of view, there's cissexuals and transsexuals, and there's this form of marginalization called cissexism. And let me describe it to you. And one of the ways that manifested is in this idea that like if you're gender diverse, that can be good because you're shattering the binary, but if you're
mhm.
transsexual, you're reinforcing it. And I started on purpose to like kind of to make a point. I started referring to that as the radical conservative gender binary. It's like
Right, right.
you're dividing us up into two categories, like the radical people and the conservative people, and you're just lumping me into one of those two groups. I wanted to get to the bottom of where these ideas came from, and so I started
Mhm,
researching, the different academics, the anthropologists and the historians and the
mhm.
sociologists, and all these people sort of kind of created this general idea. So that's how I got involved in it through writing Whip and Girl.
Yeah, and like a lot of those things in the third and the alleged fourth wave, obviously they emerged as a reaction to what came before it in the second wave, and
Mhm.
for primarily like cultural feminists that emerged from it, right? But and that's completely understandable. Same as reacting to like the transsexualism diagnosis and all that kind of stuff by
Yeah.
rejecting the binary that you have to, if you do transition, you have to just go through the Harry Benjamin sex change conveyor and emerge as close to a cis woman or a cis man on the other side as humanly possible, right?
Mhm.
So that does make sense. However, one of those things that happened in reaction to that is on you sort of observe kind of the queer community ceding to the conservatives a la Janice Raymond the fact that feminism is the
Mhm,
language of anti-queerness, that it's
mhm.
essentially handing conservatives words like patriarchy and, dominance feminism and stuff like that. It's basically admitting that, yep, those are yours, and we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the oppression of women anymore. We are past that now. Which is very silly because it ends up with things that analyze the gender binary and claim things like the gender binary is a thing that exists and it's oppressive and we have it and it's bad, but then it never actually addresses why it exists. It kind of just says, well, it's power and people like power and that's why we have it. And it's just, just kind of flounders at the foundation, basically. And the other thing is that, well, it's still culturally feminist. It's specifically choice feminist because it makes the claim that if you specifically embody in some way the shattering of the gender binary, then you are the antidote of the patriarchy, which begs the question of like, well, okay, so let's take for granted that transsexuals of the decadent West are doing nothing to combat patriarchy, and their lives simply are cogs in the machine that just keep it turning. Let's say that that's true. But then we have the enlightened India with magical hijras that have allegedly been there since the dawn of time. Either you'd have to make the claim, recognizing that India is still a patriarchal society, you'd have to admit that the shattering is not very effective because there is still patriarchy in India, even after thousands of years. Or you have to somehow make the claim that the patriarchy in India either didn't exist or doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, there's a surprising amount of scholarship, including in decolonial feminism, that talks about how like all non-Western societies before colonization did not have patriarchy, and there's even been like scholarship in anthropology. Like this is a while ago. This is before like 1973, which I think was like the publication of the first paper that was like considered the first work of feminist anthropology. But before that, it was like relatively common to claim that societies like India and China were like matriarchal because we had goddess worship. So people have contorted themselves into very silly positions in order to like prop up some very strange and empirically dubious, let's just say, ideas about non-Western societies. But that aside, so thank you very much, Julia, for like giving us a sort of like rundown on the queer discourses of the 90s and the 2000s. They sound every bit as chaotic as I'd always imagined when I read about them. So, you can take like two perspectives on that, right? As you both covered, in order to be like generous to the queers of the time, feminism at the time was, or at the very least, we were on the sort of like the tail end of radical feminism and the second wave movement, and it was kind of devolving into this sort of like very reactionary collaborations with the state, and the sex wars, and all of this divine feminine woo that seemed to really retrench this like very particular idea of like gender can really only be two things. We can only exist within this dichotomy. Therefore, we want to push back against that, right? And in that sense, it's somewhat understandable as to like why the schism between sort of like queer politics and wider feminism happened in this historical context. At the same time, like I think Emma mentioned Janice Raymond earlier, and when I wrote The Third Sex, talking about the history of like third sex things specifically through the lens of an Indian trans woman, save this for like a reveal in the middle of the essay, almost as a jump scare. I don't quite trust myself to be able to like structure this podcast episode narratively in the same way, so I'll just say it out right now and then we'll go into it later. But like the idea that like transsexual identity in the West is this like purely medical construct, and that if you are a trans woman specifically, like if you transition and you identify as a quote unquote binary woman or a binary man even, that's patriarchal and regressive and upholding gender stereotypes. That's from transsexual empire. Like I know people like tack on a lot of like very interesting rationale and gender politics to it these days, but like that is just vintage transsexual empire. That is just what Janice Raymond and people who share Janice Raymond's views of trans women and her ideas just believe. We're still somewhat like dealing with the hangover of that, with the after effects of like those kind of things, because like there's transphobia, but I think like people sometimes sorely underestimate how much like specifically a fear of transition or like an attachment to the idea that you fundamentally cannot change sex, that sex cannot be immutable, how core that is to a lot of transphobic ideas and to a lot of cis-sexism and a lot of cis fears of transition, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot that I think ties into this
Mhm.
is that I was just working on this for a video that will eventually come out. But I was
Mhm.
listening all the different causes of what causes people to be transsexual over the
Mhm.
years, and there's a bajillion of them. Everything from chemicals in the environment to like faulty parent-child dynamics to nowadays there's
Sure.
social contagion and gender ideology. And like you can just, Elon Musk recently said that it's like that white men have been demonized and that's why they're transsexuals now, which I don't know how that explains. Anyway,
No,
so but
that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I transitioned because of how much I hate white men. Elon got it in one. Perfect.
okay, so it can explain some of our transitions, but maybe not all.
Yeah, you grew up in India, of course, but like the moment you learned what a white man is, you're like, ew.
Yeah, gross. Like I must transition immediately to destroy the white race, I guess. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, so anyway, it's kind of like we're sort of like Rorschach tests, and I think whether they want to admit it or not, a lot of people just are kind of grossed out by people physically
Mm-hmm.
transitioning, like
Yep.
just on a very visceral level. And I think it's
Mm-hmm.
because of the fact that, like, well, a lot of them don't want to admit that they have a gender identity, right? But
Mm-hmm.
as soon as you like suggest to them like ways in which they could potentially, oh, well, you could go on hormones, you could do this to your body. I think
Mm-hmm.
people just viscerally get disgusted to a certain degree,
Yep.
and it makes them they have to explain us, and we become this
Uh-huh.
Rorschach test for whatever's going on in their own brains. um,
Yeah. And I want to also remark that there is also a lot of, usually in almost every culture, a lot of cultural messaging to be disgusted with the concept of changing gender or to ridicule it. So
Absolutely.
there's a lot of like, speaking of gender expansive foreign societies, like for example,
Mm-hmm.
from my home region specifically, not even home country, home region, there is like a
Mm-hmm.
tradition of like at the end of the year, pagan year, for like usually men to dress up sort of panto style, and
Mm-hmm.
some of those costumes are women, and it's supposed to be parodic and funny. And almost every culture has something like that. So you're taught basically from the cradle, like, this is funny, this is disgusting, this is for the holidays to dress up and laugh at, but this is not to live as. And, it's like years of conditioning when you see someone actually be sincerely and seriously what you have been taught is disgusting and laughable,
Mm-hmm.
that I think really comes up for people, and even for queer people, even for trans people themselves, because like you're not exempt from it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that transphobia, and transmisogyny that, like, I experience from, like, the straight world, a lot of times it is very direct. It's just like, what you are, you're a
Hmm.
freak, and you're gross, and blah, 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 right? They will say all that, but kind of especially if you're in a queer-friendly academic setting where people
Mm-hmm.
just if you feel that way about transsexuals, you just can't say that.
Hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
you can put trans people, transsexuals, you can fit us into your theories, and so that's how you get the Janice Raymond
Mm-hmm.
saying that, oh well, both, kind of in the enemy is both too strong and too weak, where she makes the
Yep.
argument that, oh well, transsexuals are just like deluded by gender stereotypes and reinforcing the gender binary that way. But then also at the same time, we're like evil men infiltrating women's spaces, in order to
Mm-hmm.
like metaphorically or literally rape women's bodies, to use her language. So, so yeah, so people are just essentially using whatever theories they have to express the fact that they don't like transsexuals, they don't like the idea of
Mm-hmm.
people physically changing their sex, and so you have this world of gender diversity where, gender diverse people spring up in whatever culture or communities, whether people are accepting or demonizing of us. And,
Mm-hmm.
so any given trans person will have different experiences, whether they transition or not, whether there's access to that or not, which is something that definitely is playing a role here where,
Yep.
in
Yep.
the evil Western, uh the evil Western societies where, doctors are creating transsexuals and everything, it's like, well, actually, in those societies, trans people find out that you can transition, and some trans people can access those hormones and those surgeries. Anyway, so I think people are just naturally gender diverse, and
Mm-hmm.
the idea that they have to make the icky transsexuals like the gender conservatives, and the people who don't transition but are gender diverse are like celebrated for breaking the gender binary and showing that gender is merely constructed. It's just like this intellectualizing of the fact that they find us gross, I think. Or at least that's definitely that's one of the currents driving this.
Yeah, because so somewhat unfortunate thing is that like we haven't moved past like gender, discourses of like gender and sexuality. We haven't like moved as forward in time as we'd like to. You have these ideas like I come across like very interesting history discussions. Sometimes like someone will be like, "Oh, in Rome, they had very different ideas of sexuality and gender. Where it wasn't like man and woman. It was like whether you're being penetrated or doing the penetrating." And it's like, well, that's actually kind of very similar to how we think about sex even today. Even when we have all these additional discourses, it's not necessarily true that we have like moved past our oldest and most traditional ideas, and that doesn't inform our current ideas either. And sort of in that sense, even though like so you talk at the very beginning about how like, in the 90s you were coming across all these people who were undergoing medical transition, but also not identifying with like manhood or womanhood, and that was like sort of like a new thing at the time, and we were trying to expand the idea of what gender diversity could even look like, and that was unarguably a good thing. But then at the same time, even if you are a part of these gender diverse communities and you have like discovered things about yourself, you're queer, you're gender non-conforming, you're non-binary, which is the word we have for it today, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have unpacked your discomfort or your disgust with transition, and it can manifest in some very interesting and harmful ways. And unfortunately, there is a lot of academic theory, like there are many different rationales that you can pick, whether you want to go from the more conservative end, like dear Elon Musk, or whether you want to pick something more from the social sciences and anthropology milieu. So that brings me to a very interesting thing about Whipping Girl that really stood out to me when I was reading it. So Whipping Girl is rightfully and obviously considered a landmark work of transfeminism. And for a variety of reasons. A lot of people who talk about Whipping Girl, they're thinking about like the articulation of transmisogyny, or they're thinking about the media analyses, or they're thinking about the repudiation of a lot of sexological myths about trans women and things like that. But the parts of Whipping Girl that really stood out to me in particular were where you talked about third sexing and sort of like identified third genders and third sexing in these like small little passages, but like in two very distinct and important ways. The first of which you said was, and that really makes the whole house of cards fall down, right? Because in the sort of like wider academic canon, there's this idea that the transsexual is this like binary Western medicalized construct, and non-Western societies have these third genders. And then there was this observation in Whipping Girl where it was like, well, actually, there's a couple of these people that you'd consider third gender in these like foreign societies who actually transition once they, have the resources or have the ability to actually access transition. A couple of them do transition. And that kind of makes the whole house of cards fall down, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So what I think the sources that I cite for that, because I'm just reading a lot, both as kind of a trans person and a feminist, and then I'm also doing research for Whipping Girl. And the passages I
Mm-hmm.
came across were both by trans authors. I think that's very important. And one
Yeah.
was Joan Roughgarden in Evolution's Rainbow. She talked about it, and the other one was Patrick Califia in his book Sex
Mm-hmm.
Changes. Both of them talk about particular people who come from these cultures. I don't remember the exact people they're referring to, but I think there's one case of someone who was a Hijra. But
Mm-hmm.
basically, these are people from these cultures that have these celebrated third sexes where they don't transition. But then, if they do have access to hormones, if they find out that that's available, they want that, right? And
Yeah.
I think
Mm-hmm.
it goes back to a lot of these same academics also like to portray transsexuality as something, and this is obviously a very Janice Raymond part of her thesis, the
Mm-hmm.
construction, these doctors are constructing the male to constructed females, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, kind of weird. It's like, well, why would these patriarchal sexologists just decide to turn men into women, right? It's just sort of
Yeah.
a bizarre thing. But she even has, I think this is in the first edition of the book, which I had, but
Mm-hmm.
I think she took it out of the second one, where she actually says that they're doing it in order to replace women, like they're constructing women
Oh
in order to
my.
replace bio women. Yeah, I quote it in
Full
Whipping
on
Girl.
replacement theory. Oh my God. Okay. Yeah, I hadn't seen
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
edition. Amazing.
Yeah.
Huh?
But then if you actually look, a lot of kind of the really famous transsexuals, like
Mhm.
early transsexuals, notably Christine Jorgensen, and then the other one is Agnes, which is the name given. I think that was out of Harold Garfinkel's thing. So she's just known as Agnes, but there's a lot
Right, right.
written about her. Basically, both of them sought out hormones on their own before
Mm-hmm.
like there was this access that you could have to transitioning. So this is something that a lot of us who are trans people kind of have strong feelings about our bodies that we have for a lot of our lives. And,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to be a girl when I was a kid, and I didn't even know that that was possible. And so I
Yep.
think it makes sense that a lot of gender diverse people, some people will kind of want to change their bodies. And the idea that these academics kind of have to separate these things out as if, none of the gender diverse people from all these other cultures ever want to change their body.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only in this, evil Western medical, empire, if you will, where that's the only place where they want to medicalize these gender diverse people. It's actually like, well, gender diverse people are gender diverse, and some people are going to want to transition if they know that that's possible for them.
Yeah, and that's kind of an obvious conclusion you're drawn to if you are thinking about gender diversity as a kind of naturally occurring phenomena. But that's sort of the hiccup here, right? People aren't really thinking about us sort of rationally with cool heads. They're bringing in their biases, they're bringing in their own hangups into what gender is and what it should be like and how fixed or unfixed it should be. And it results in all of these weird points of view and contradictions that are easily resolved by just viewing us as people almost with our own wants and desires and who are products of our environments that are trying to deny us these things that we want. So that's the first so that was the first interesting thing in Whipping Girl. The second interesting thing in Whipping Girl that I saw is this thing I love doing, by the way. Whenever I see bad social science applied to non-Western societies, the first thing I want to do that I love doing, I love applying it to Western societies immediately. Because because there's so much stuff that academics and scholars like to say about non-Western societies that is completely nonsensical if you apply it to the West or it reveals something. Okay, so stay with me. If non-Western societies have these third genders who are constructed in this particular way, they're usually quote unquote born male. They wear women's clothes. They take women's names. They present femininely. They usually take the quote unquote penetrable or submissive role in sex. And they're usually impoverished, pushed out of societies, formed their own communities, locked out of the formal economy, and they have to resort to begging and sex work. And it's those are all some very interesting criteria that sound kind of familiar. Is there any group in the West, for example, that all of those criteria apply to if we were to apply them to the West?
No, but you see, it's kind of like, how do you claim that Hijra or the priestesses from ancient Rome and stuff like that, how do you claim that they were not medicalized transsexuals even though they routinely performed castrations on themselves or on each other? Well, you silly historical people and brown people don't have medicine. They only have magic.
Yeah, so that's the most absurd part of it, right? And I love that Whipping Girl specifically went into it like that, because the section I'm remembering is you talk about at one point at length about how when you talk to cis people or straight people, sometimes they'll treat you like a woman up until they find out that you're trans, and then as soon as they find out that you're trans, suddenly they look at you differently. Suddenly they're not calling you a woman anymore. Suddenly you're a he, she, or you're an MTF instead of a woman. And what is that but a form of third gendering?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, just the way in which some people will call, upon finding out someone is trans, they'll start calling the person an it. Or
Mhm.
kind of our favorite, cis people who have a real difficult time with they, them pronouns when meaning a non-binary person. How,
Yes, exactly.
will have no problems calling me she and her. And then once they find out I'm trans, all of a sudden they will they, them me, right?
Easily.
Yeah. So it's this third sex exists in people's minds as sort of it's just the container in which people they can't neatly categorize into the man or
Yes.
the woman groups. They just
Mhm.
find a way to put us in that group. And so it is very bizarre knowing that as a trans person, having those experiences and them being told that, whoa, well, actually, this is this, empowering, amazing thing that there's these third sexes and third genders out there in other cultures. It's like, well, my culture lumps me into a third category all the time. So,
Yeah, and I
yeah.
think like the way the sort of mismatch in how if you ask to be a they them or it's to but that's rarer, they can't do it. But when it's someone that they either find out as trans or clock as trans or think that they clock as trans, immediately these are the only pronouns they can use because like in those cases obviously they is the polite person's it, right? It
Yeah.
betrays what the purpose of the third category is. Because when people ask to be recognized as such, it's it's a request to be recognized as basically equal to the existing genders, right? It's a request of like, this is me as a person. But a third gender is not for people, it's for offal, basically. For people that are cast out on the margins, it can't be polite.
Yeah, okay, so I'm about to reveal something that might shock our listeners to their very core.
Really?
Yeah, Emma and I identify a little bit. Sometimes we dabble in it, but we do, in fact, identify as non-binary.
Dun, dun, dun.
And at the same time, you know, I do experience what I would call third sexing, or that I have called degendering, this sort of like dehumanization, this non-recognition of me, or rather this like denial of my womanhood to sort me to a sort of lower, more dehumanized, more degraded category. And I think sometimes like people like non-binary people, queer people in the West, sometimes they get a little bit tripped up because like to them they think that like, well, if there is an outside of the binary and outside of man or woman, and I want to identify as that, that is like progressive and that is like anti-patriarchal by definition, right? But as we're alluding to, and as we're going to get into more as we talk about more about the particularities of this scholarship that we're discussing, the thing is that the third sex or the third gendering or this third category, this implicit category that is like not particularly defined or differentiated, but exists as a counterpoint to the binary of man and woman, it's considered a fail state, basically, and it's always been an indelible part of patriarchal societies that does reinforce and prop up the patriarchy. Because if you have standards for manhood and you have standards for womanhood, and you have a social system that coerces people into upholding or living up those standards, otherwise they'll be punished, that means that like there is some understanding of what kind of person is like degraded, dehumanized, made a lesser entity because they have failed to live up to those standards of manhood and womanhood. To wit, if you have to pass a standard of gender, then there is a way to fail those standards of gender. And that is somewhat, it almost seems tautological when you lay it out like that, but like that is the sense in which third sexing and third gendering isn't this like massive patriarchy shattering construct, but is kind of an endemic feature of patriarchies and has been historically. The patriarchy shattering part comes in if you walk over and you're like, well, I think the third sexes should be treated just like, the second or even the first sex. Gasp. like at the end of the day, that is the problem that we're trying to solve, right? The existence of a third sex doesn't fix patriarchy any more than the existence of the second sex did. The problem is still that we are not given the same place as the first, the adored, the highest, best among sexes. Black.
Yeah, the way the sort of the non-binary catch-22 is applied to me is a little bit funny. Because it's very different coming from cis and from trans people. From cis people, it's just like you're broken forever, you can never be a woman again kind of thing, which is extremely telling. By the way, if you tuned in for the first time ever into Cracked Ivory, I'm D-trans. I was being funny in the beginning about being a cis woman that's not supposed to be here. But anyway, from trans people, it's different, and it drives me especially up the wall because it's usually phrased as, well, if you're non-binary, then you haven't really detransitioned, which means you shouldn't be talking about detransition. And it's kind of like, okay, it's a really interesting outgrowth of the whole third genderinos are the most progressive emo. That's like, oh, well, detransitioning is reactionary, so if we just demote you from womanhood a little bit, because it always comes from, well, if you're non-binary, then you're not really a woman, right? So you can't claim to have detransitioned from being a man. So we claim you, little one, but also please kindly shut up. It's very funny. But it reminds me a little bit of how the claims of like, Hydra are super duper enlightened third sexes and all stuff like that is entirely ignoring the things the Hydra actually say and do and stuff like that. Because like
Mhm.
it's true that
Mhm.
Hydra are a dumping ground for transfeminized people and sometimes even intersex assigned female at birth people. But from what I see from like Hijra literature and people that have written stuff from India, they do recognize that they're transfeminized and they want to have solidarity with trans women and trans femme people in general from the West. It would be nice. I know that like queer people from all kinds of countries that are more transphobic and more homophobic than some Western ones would love solidarity from places that are better off, because you want to see, to learn how to do the activism. You want support, material and non-material, and then being like, shh, shut the fuck up, sweetie, shut the fuck up. You are not a transsexual. You are nothing like those icky wiki trans women. Just shut the fuck up and stand pretty over there so I can write my paper about expansive genders. You know? You know? I mean,
Yeah. The really funny thing is that there's like a version of this within India itself. So like, okay, this idea of transsexual as like Western and like medicalized and things like that. Well, obviously, like stuff like that trickles down, and obviously, like there are upper caste and affluent and richer queer people in India, and like, okay, cool, like the Harry Benjamin stuff has trickled down to India as well. So there is a class, a subset of transsexual women in India who are just like, we're transsexual women. We are like classy and like respectable queers and assimilationists. We're nothing like those lower caste, lower class, like, sex working, begging Hydra. We're not the same thing at all. And every time I see opinions like that, I want to break things. It's like very funny. It's sort of like an inverse of the sort of like Western academic idea of the Hydra, right? Because like, they're both sort of saying that like a transsexual woman and a Hydra are some kind of like essentially different thing when they do so many of the same things, including pursue transition. Like, because of the material circumstances, a Westerner will be like, oh no, a Hydra is some special third gender. And if you call them transsexual, that's colonizing and a violence. And then in India, it's like, no, a Hydra is this like, horrible thing that we don't want to be associated with. Because, newsflash, the Hydra are not venerated in India. They're quite oppressed. Like when I first learned of the existence of Hydra as a child, it was in the context of the word being used as a slur.
so having heard you say that, I have $1 million question.
Uh-huh.
For the trans community of India, Talia, is Hydra just AGP?
Uh,
Cathedrals everywhere for those with eyes to see.
Thank
GPs
you.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking me that question. If this episode was 3 hours long, I still don't think I could explain all of the nuances of queer and trans and gender politics in India. Suffice it to say, though, it's very complicated, and the simplistic portrait painted by anthropologists and Western scholars, uh, you know, even just for India, but obviously for non-Western societies as a whole, is a little bit reductive and simplistic.
Yeah. I would add this here to another version of this. So obviously the whole like true transsexual versus AGP coming out of the
Mhm.
Blanchard and the sexology world, that's like one aspect of it. But I remember in the zeros, the same debate would happen a lot, and it was like called the transsexual versus transgender debate. And this sounds weird now because transgender has just become the term that a lot of people who
Mhm.
transition will use too. But because
Yeah.
a lot of the people who first, again, the activists in the 90s who, were the transgender movement, and, you had a lot of people who were non-binary or who were non-heteronormative. Um, and those people, since they were the ones who were like early on, the first ones pushing for this like transgender umbrella and everything, there were some transsexuals who considered themselves like the real transsexuals or the true transsexuals. And
Mhm.
they would say we have to get rid of all these transgender people, right? And so
God.
I just think that this is a type of trans respectability politics that comes up
Yep, yep,
over
yep.
and over and over again, where there's some people who fit fairly well into the gender binary, who are transsexuals, who like look at everybody else as those are the perverts and the freaks and the fakes, right?
Yep,
But
yep, yep.
but also within our community, sometimes there's a flip of that where you'll get some people who are like, oh, well, I'm a subversive, gender bending, blurring the line person, whereas those transsexuals are just reinforcing the gender binary. It's like, it's the same binary that just keeps flipping, where it's like respectability politics when true transsexuals are doing it, but it becomes like this radical conservative binary when people who are, whatever you want to say, gender bendy or non-binary or whoever else does it. So I just think it's funny, not in a haha way, but in a sad way, that we just keep creating these gender binaries. As much as we're like upset about the whole man-woman gender binary, we just kind of create these other gender binaries over and over again.
Honestly, like it reminds me, it feels to me like it kind of has a root in a sort of essentialist understanding of true gender, if that makes sense. Like because you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of the eternal debate: who's the realer woman? The one who is a respectable trad wife that politely gets pregnant, or the super sexy whore that everyone wants? Like because it's because both of those things are what a woman is, and it's the eternal debate between which one is the realer woman and which one gets and it's trans women do it too, obviously.
The answer is both of you are subject to misogyny and are like exploited in different ways. Can you shut the fuck up and defeat patriarchy already?
Right, but this reminds me also, the reason why I say this is because it's kind of ultimately the debate of who is the true trans, who deserves to be here, who like deserves support, basically. It's not always a question of like who deserves access to transition. I think like, especially in most like trans circles these days, given especially the climate, I think the general consensus is that you should be able to access transition no matter what. So it's a conversation I feel like generally moved on from that, but now it's more like who deserves to be like protected and defended by other trans people, who is owed solidarity and who isn't, kind of thing, which is still a way of like sort of organizing resources around who is the true transgender, who is the true gender, right? And the kind of fight between that, because that's the thing, transness embodies both the like shatter the binary, move the boundaries kind of thing, and it embodies moving from one category to another. That's the thing, that's what it is. And it's just kind of like picking one aspect of a broad like social category and being like, and choosing the one that you like better for whatever reason, and being like, no, this is the one that fits me, I belong here, you don't, kind of thing. Yeah, if you know what I mean.
And and you know what the big irony is of all that? So we've been talking a lot about shifting terms and about like, which one is considered more respectable, which one is considered more acceptable and things like that. So the thing about all of that is that like the goalposts and the targets and they're always drifting and they're always subject to a certain degree of semantic shift. Like, okay, let's focus on two for an example. What is the difference between transsexuals and transgenders? To take like one that the social sciences was in love with for a second. Are the transsexuals the hyper medicalized ones and the transsexuals the cool gender non-conforming non-medicalized ones? And the answer is no, obviously not, because as it turns out, these communities have more in common than they have differences. And like those, the gender non-conforming ones sometimes, frequently even, will want some kind of transsexual thing going on, will want some kind of like bodily changes. And the transsexuals who are medicalized and change their bodies very frequently don't like want to be a Stepford wife or a macho alpha man, because we have some kind of gender fuckiness going on. So like, whatever split you want to make, the non-binary and the binary, the gender queers and the non-gender queers, the transsexuals and the transgenders, we all have a lot more in common than we have differences, and that's why hard boundaries are both silly and counterproductive. And that's why these semantic drifts and semantic shifts in how we refer to each other keep occurring, because as it turns out, the transsexuals are a bit transgender and the transgenders are a bit transsexual. It's just kind of how things shake out in practical terms on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's like a really good thing that came out of the transgender movement, even though, some of the people kind of got a little bit too obsessed with the shattering the gender binary, but not necessarily talking about the hierarchy between the two groups in the gender binary, right? But I think that one really powerful thing about it was that before then, there were the transsexuals and then there were the transvestites, and they were completely different. And there is a huge transfeminine, transmasculine communities were kind of
Mm-hmm.
often segregated in ways, not officially segregated. And there's definitely, the group that
Mm-hmm.
I went to in 1994, it was mostly transfeminine people, but there were some transmasculine people there. But there were all these different groups, and they were like, well, actually, all of us, we all fall into essentially this category, which, you know, is kind of essentially a third sex category. We are all people who are marginalized, because of, the fact that we don't fit neatly into either of the two binary groups, the two cis
Mm-hmm.
binaries, right? And we don't fall neatly into that. And so we should all get together, whether you're transsexual or non binary or intersex or some combination thereof. And we should band
Mm-hmm.
together and kind of challenge the marginalization we face. And that is a very third sex sort of, or third gender, coming at it
Mm-hmm.
from that angle, right? And then that third group, us, we can say, well, we're transgender, but the rest of y'all are cisgender. And then you can work to kind of like decenter that binary. Talia, in your third sex essay, you do a really good job
Mm-hmm.
of pointing out all the things that Nanda ignores, the things that the Hydra tell her that she doesn't really take into account about how they see themselves, because she was so insistent in kind of creating this, you know, uh, creating the separation between, progressive third sexes in other cultures and this evil westernized transsexual. Um,
Yep. Yep.
she was so invested in that she just refused to see what people from these groups were telling her. And then the same thing goes for in her book, Gender Diversity, because I was reading through
Mm-hmm.
those passages, the transsexualism versus transgenderism chapters or sections in that book. And she's talking about transsexuals like being these horrible, evil, reinforcing, upholding the patriarchy or gender system on the one hand. And then she goes to transgenderism and talks about how like progressive they are without like talking at all about, and she's writing, I think that's in like 2000. And so she doesn't
Yeah, it was 2000.
she doesn't reference Leslie Feinberg or Kate Bornstein, or probably the two most prominent trans writers of the time. The fact that both
Mm-hmm.
of them took steps to physically transition and were, non-binary and forwarding the term transgender. And then I'm going through also in the book, she cites, it's this book, you don't really hear about it anymore. It's by
Okay.
Anne Boleyn. It's called In Search of Eve and Sexual Rites
Mm,
of Passage. So,
I
Mm-hmm.
have heard of this, but
yeah.
like a long
So
time ago.
yeah. So
Mhm.
basically, what Anne Boleyn did was what Janice Raymond kind of pretended to do, but Anne Boleyn actually
Mm-hmm.
does it for real, which is interview people who are transsexuals who are going through a gender clinic, and where Janice Raymond just interviewed them superficially and plucked out the things that she wanted to use to show that transsexuals are like, dupes of the medical system and overly embracing, gender stereotypes. Anne Boleyn like interviews these people, gets to know them and everything. And she talks about the diversity within the transsexuals, who I think are all trans women,
Mm-hmm.
but the diversity amongst them, how they actually all have like different sense of styles. Like I think at one point she says trans women's styles differ as much as, she doesn't say cis women's styles. She talks about
Right. Right.
how these transsexuals that, they definitely want to have relationships like, most people do, but she's like, they also wanted to have careers, and they also, there's more to them than they wanted to be the transsexual trad wife,
Yeah.
stereotype that
Mm.
Janice Raymond pushes. So anyway,
Women who want to have careers, like, what will they
yeah,
think
can
of
you believe
next?
that?
Truly.
Yeah. But anyway, so just to make the point that Nanda like read Anne Boleyn's book and cites it in
Mhm.
Gender Diversity in her arguments that transsexuals are just like this, upholding sexist stereotypes uh category of people. So it's very clear. It's, while, her thesis is a little bit different than Janice Raymond's,
Mhm.
It's very clear they both were like just picking and choosing what they wanted to hear from the people they were interviewing in order to make their thesis work, even if their theses were a little bit different. And
Yeah,
just to be
very
clear,
much the
because
same playbook.
yeah. And just to be clear, every time I say the word theses, it always sounds weird to me. Like when I write it, it's fine, but it sounds a lot like feces. But some people's theses are actually reminiscent of feces, if you get my drift.
More or less, I do, yeah. Okay, so I think that's actually a good point for us to actually talk a little bit more about Serena Nanda, who we haven't like extensively been naming throughout the entire episode, but who is somewhat the antagonist of all of this. Now, I'm not going to make a very definitive statement about whether Serena Nanda is like necessarily the genesis of the third sexing orientalism, or like its popularization um in the modern academic landscape. It feels like it sometimes, and I know for a fact that Serena Nanda's work on the Hijra, Neither Man Nor Woman, which was first published in 1990, is probably the most widely cited work on the Hijra in the Western Academy. So that doesn't help. But yeah, so the thing is that, like, these ideas are very prevalent in Western anthropology and have trickled down into even modern queer studies and trans studies. But there's a couple of scholars who were like a little bit more instrumental in pushing these narratives than others. And one of those figures is Serena Nanda. Now, I used to be a little bit more gun shy about this, about speculate, quote unquote, speculating about this in public before, but like I am well past caring. Now, it doesn't exactly matter what Serena Nanda's race is, because there's Gayatri Reddy, there's like Khan, there are scholars, see diaspora scholars and Desi scholars who have like put out crack scholarship on the Hijra. So whether Serena Nanda herself is Desi or not doesn't matter. But that bitch white, and you can tell when she writes, because Neither Man Nor Woman is the most breathtakingly like eat, pray, love book I have ever read. And it's not a work of fiction. It's passing itself off as a serious work of anthropology, as an ethnography. There's an entire section in the beginning of the book where she talks about like, I took so much care to interview the Hijra, and like I had them double translated and everything. And it sort of feels like it should be setting a standard for like interviewing and like representing the words of the people of a culture that you're not familiar with. But like all of the translation and like diligence ends up not mattering, because like she puts down the words of like a Hijra subject, right? And actually, I will just like tell you this story from her book off the top of my head, because again, I've talked about this book so much I can just tell you entire sections off the top of my head. This is one particular story from a Hijra subject that Serena Nanda narrates in her book, where the Hijra subject tells her of this myth among their people, that once there was a Hijra woman and she was having an argument with a guy, and so the Hijra and the guy went to a magistrate. The Hijra woman said, I am a lady, and the guy disagreed. And so, they were asking the magistrate to settle their dispute. And the magistrate was like, well, can you give birth? And the Hijra woman was like, no. And then the magistrate said, well, you're not a woman. Fuck off. Well, I added the fuck off for embellishment, but that was the vibe. Serena Nanda reproduces the story in full in her book, right? It's double translated, due diligence, all of that. And then she turns to the audience rhetorically and says, this story demonstrates that Hijra understand that they are not women. And it's like, huh? That's very interesting, because I just read, because she just said, because I just read the words, I am a lady, like right. And she does this multiple times in the book. She'll tell you a story where like Hydra, like, "Oh, we dress as women, we have women's names, we call each other women's names, we want to be counted as women in the census. Our activism is oriented around women. I take hormones, and this isn't the 80s. So if Hydra communities were taking hormones in the 80s, you bet that they have an awareness and more access to that now. And the entire time, Serena Nanda ignores all of that and starts talking about Hinduism. Like, I swear to God, she talks more about Hinduism than the things that the Hijras say in this book of hers. She is like, well, there was a story in the Ramayana where da 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 da, and this happened, and oh, Hindu mythology has like bigender and multigender goddess aspects of Shiva and Parvati, all of this stuff that doesn't actually have much relevance to the day-to-day lives of the Hijra, because in the day-to-day lives of the Hijra, they are forced out of the formal economy. They are, they are like mocked, and the word for them is used as a slur. Um, they have to like survive on the fringes. They have to beg at ceremonies, or they have to resort to sex work. And Nanda isn't interested in exploring any of that because she wants this one particular narrative to raise up about how the Hijras are like they're religious ascetics, and the reason that they like go and get themselves emasculated is because of like a commitment to the goddess, blah 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 blah. And it's like you can just it's very frustrating to read, not just as a trans woman, but also as an Indian trans woman, where like I lived in this society, I grew up in this society, I grew up in this society in the same time that at the same time that like Nanda was there farting about and interviewing people and getting, all these future perspectives and stories filtered through a very cis lens. And it's just like it's like she's describing a foreign country because, no, we don't venerate the Hijra, and we don't have a special place for them in our society unless you count the gutter a special place, you know? And it's just like incredibly frustrating to see like it's a double thing, right? It's like epistemic injustice against trans people and trans women, obviously, because our perspectives are never taken seriously, but it's also epistemic injustice against third world women specifically, because our perspectives are also never taken seriously. So you can just so you have this one woman who just goes abroad to a country and just talks about how like yeah, they treat their trans people like a religious cult over there, and entire academic disciplines will just go okay, and she'll be cited for 40 years.
Yeah, it's like, you can joke about how you know that Hijra are trans women because they will say
Mhm,
the sky is blue, and then a cis person will turn around and is like, clearly, this person believes that the sky is green, and everyone will agree.
mhm,
Much like, a lot of scholarship written in the West about Western trans women, like,
mhm,
Blanchard et al. But it is actually fascinating how easily the wool can be pulled over people's eyes,
mhm,
even those that do not subscribe to Hinduism or do not have an investment into religious philosophy, that just like
mhm,
do not seem to interrogate that the written testimony that Nanda wrote down herself contradicts what
mhm.
she's saying. It's kind of shocking.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me very much of like Janice Raymond, because the same thing happens in the transsexual empire. She's got some. I know you said, Julia, that like that like she interviewed trans women at the clinic in a sort of very cursory way, but one of the women actually told her, Jan, we actually have to pretend to be very feminine for the benefit of the clinic's doctors. And Jan was like, okay, and she wrote that down. That's in the transsexual empire. She wrote it down,
Yeah.
and then she turned around and kept spouting the propaganda anyway. It's amazing. We can say things and it will just like roll off of cis minds somehow.
Yeah, it's well, this is why I was talking earlier about like how like anyone can invent whatever cause they want for like why transsexuals exist, and like people will
Hmm.
just believe it, and it's like it does it even though they don't make sense, and none of these things explain everybody, right? But it's just this thing that yeah, and so the exact same thing is here where these people have their theses and like they're just rolling with it, but because we're just sort of a Rorschach blot that like that
Hmm.
cis people can put whatever theories they want on, like I think cis readers kind of will overlook the inconsistencies in the same way that if someone wants to insist that, oh, well, people are trans because of social contagion or people are trans because of chemicals in the environment. And you can argue, well, actually, here's all the evidence that that's not true, or at least it's not true for a lot of people. It doesn't matter because it's like people just they don't really care what is actually going on with trans people. They're more interested in the theorizing about us And whatever theory people want to plop on us, it's like a valid theory. It's very frustrating and yes, very bizarre and illogical. But yeah, I just we are the Rorschach blots for the cisgender population to interpret however they want, and however they interpret us has more power and more weight than anything we say about ourselves.
And ain't that the truth? So okay. So now this brings me to the section of the discussion where it's like it's going to get like a little alt history or like maybe even a little fanficky, but just like stay with me for a second, okay? So this bit is very core to the overall point of my essay, The Third Sex, and what I use to eventually build up what I call the third sexing thesis. Just this idea that actually you talked about earlier, Julia, about how like the third sex is a space that like all gender diverse people are in some way dumped into, just a ground of patriarchal failures who have more to gain from working together than like hashing out the minute differences between each other. And there's this one very illustrative bit in Nanda's book that I think about a lot, and about how differently it could have gone if it had been interpreted with a feminist lens. So again, this is very, very early in the book, chapter 1 or 2 even. Serena Nanda is in India. She's attached with a Hijra troupe, and the Hijra troupe is performing at, I believe, a wedding. A couple has just gotten married, and the Hijra show up and they perform and they beg for arms at like weddings and at the birth of children and things like that. So Nanda's there and she is observing these Hijra and she's describing them in these horrible, dehumanizing ways, saying that they are a parody or like a mockery of femininity, that they are vulgar mimics of women, and all of this lovely language that makes it perfectly clear what she thinks of them. And and at like other spots in the book, she'll say things like, oh, Hijra can't be women because they don't behave like demure Hindu women and are very loud and swear in public, which well, I guess my mom was a Hijra and I never knew, but whatever. But the Hijra troupe are performing at the wedding, and Nanda makes this like in the middle of all of her insults. She makes this very like throwaway comment, right? That she herself doesn't understand the significance of. And she just comments that though the Hijra troupe are performing for the family of the bride and the groom, the bride is locked away inside. She's not allowed to interact with the Hijra. And, the Hijra are not allowed to interact with her because of the myth that the Hidra's impotence, she specifically uses the word impotence, can spread. And I found that very interesting because impotence is not usually a word that is applied to cis women, right? It has very specific connotations of what kind of like sexual or reproductive failure impotence implies. So there's an agenda there. And Nanda just like mentions this and doesn't like think about the significance of it at all because she doesn't understand what she's reporting on. Because you see, in Indian society, we do have this myth about not impotence, infertility, because it's a very patriarchal country and the only purpose of a woman is to reproduce. So therefore, if a woman is infertile, she is treated as broken. She's treated as though she has bad energy or bad juju. We may not be like religious uniformly, but we are very superstitious people. And in a lot of places in India, infertile cis women are treated like they're like carriers of a disease, like they're vectors. And there is this idea that if you interact with or touch an infertile cis woman, if a fertile woman touches an infertile cis woman, the infertility can spread like that. So Nanda literally didn't realize, because again, she used the word impotent and she didn't comment on it further. She didn't realize that by segregating the bride away from the Hijra troupe, the Hijras were not being treated like emasculated homosexual men, or whatever her thesis was. She didn't realize that she had just reported that the Hijra were being treated like infertile women. And that's very telling, isn't it? Because like, what are trans women treated like? What is the source of trans misogyny? What is the source of all of this like third sexing and degendering and treating us as like defective? Like obviously we're not treated as men anymore, and like a fair amount of misogynistic degradation is hurled towards us. But also fundamentally, we're treated as defective women as well, right? Because we're not men anymore, but we can't be reproductively exploited. We don't have gestational capacity. We don't have wombs. So we're broken women too. And that kind of like unlocked this, like, I mean, maybe you'll disagree with me if, as to how like piercing or fundamental this insight is, but like it helps to sort of bridge the gap between transmisogyny and the misogyny that cis women face, right? Because like at the end of the day, all women are at risk of third sexing. All women are at risk of being degendered and being treated like broken, like they're awful. Like, the Hijra are largely trans feminized people, but, there are intersex and infertile women who have been forced into Hijra communities. And that's because the third sex isn't just it's also a category to shove women into if they can't fulfill their reproductive duties, you know? And I'm just imagining a world that is like was maybe a little less free of all of this, sorry, a little more free from all of this trans misogynistic bullshit, all of this cis sexism, where cis scholars and anthropologists maybe had more of a feminist lens and could maybe see trans women a little more as women, a little more as people, as humans with dignity whose struggles are worth commenting on. And I'm imagining someone a little more curious, discovering this and like realizing all the way back in the 90s maybe how the struggles of cis women and trans women and queer people are all fundamentally connected by our respective like failures or conformity or non-conformity with the reproductive edicts that all of our societies are organized around. Like, what if we had fucking radical trans feminism decades early? I mean, I don't know, the world would still probably be pretty shit, but it's nice to think of that.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a really, really important point. It's like another thing that comes to mind, example that like that happens where like who gets called a tranny, right? Well, obviously, if you're a trans person, particularly a trans feminine person, like you get called a tranny. But what cis people get called trannies, like as a kind of a slur? And it's usually
Mhm,
women who are viewed as fake in some way, right?
mhm,
Like I remember the political pundit who she's a complete asshole, Ann Coulter. But people were, and this is before the transvestigation days. But remember, people would always
mhm,
call her, it's like, oh, she's a tranny. And I think it was just because of like, like whatever, whether it was how she did her makeup or maybe she
mhm,
had like features that, would be transvestigated now in our current hellscape, but weren't back then. But yeah, so it's
mhm,
like, what were they saying when they were calling Ann Coulter a tranny? They're saying that she's a defective woman and that
mhm,
trannies are defective women. And yeah, so I mean, and that's a lot of why I feel like a lot of people think trans misogyny is related to the fact that trans women and trans feminine people are really men. And I just kind of feel
mhm,
like, that is a trope that gets used and can get
mhm,
used in trans misogynistic ways. But trans misogyny is really about viewing us as defective women, or you will, similarly, a lot of like sexual violence that occurs against trans women and trans feminine people definitely puts
mhm,
us in the feminine, subordinate, dominated space in which, the idea is like, well, if you want to be a woman, I'm going to treat you that way. Like that is really
mm,
how people
yep,
are viewing not just trans people, but all of gender, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the way like trans and related slurs apply typically to trans masculine people is also kind of telling in this regard because there is
mhm,
usually across cultures there usually aren't slurs specifically for trans masculinity or anything like that. There's sometimes a slur for a lesbian, sometimes there is no like derogatory word for lesbian. This is very much
mhm,
on purpose to like create the concept that womanhood is inescapable, specifically reproductive exploitation is not something that is possible to escape, so we don't even have words for it, right? And also
yeah,
reflective of the fact that over the course of history in most societies women have very 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 little mobility, both physical and social, so very little chance to escape from their families and possibly actuate like people born as women, right, actuate any kind of gender deviance, right? They still did, but
mhm,
what's telling is that, like for example, we have a friend of the podcast who's a trans guy, Isaac, who I don't remember if
mhm,
he ever recounted the story on the podcast, but he definitely did multiple times in just our conversations that like when he was with his family looking for clothes for prom as like a teenager in the United States, he was like, I want to wear a suit. And then his mother was like, well, I don't want you to look like the T-slur. right? And so first of all, like, yes, it's one, it reflects the fact that it's like a dumping ground, because there is no slur. Like, if you say the slur, no one will imagine a trans guy or a transmasculine person or even like a butch woman. No one will imagine that. But still, butch women and trans guys that are early in transition get called that by default because it's the closest thing that they associate with this kind of thing at all. And two, it usually, like, I can tell also from personal experience that this tends to happen generally in early transition and then never happens, maybe unless people find out that you are trans, but sometimes not even then. And it's because it's an attempt to reassert that, what do you mean you're a man? Or what do you think why do you think you're like a man? You're a woman and I will prove it to you that you're a woman, kind of thing, right? You're just you're being a defective woman, stop doing that, kind of thing. And it's also very reflective of how people that get, like, of cis people, or like putatively cis people, right? People that get transvestigated the most, not just now, but historically also, are butch women, or people who are seen as butch women. People who are seen to be women, but are seen as performing it.
Yeah, the accusation is like, you are secretly a man pretending to be a woman, and I will sniff you out. That is sort of like the first place their minds go to. And I think that's like very important in emphasizing when we talk about like how people struggle to conceptualize trans misogyny for what it is. Because, like, you know, that thing you said about how like this like really deeply rooted idea that, like, you know, we are men and being treated as such. The thing is that, like, manhood as a category is really easy to be thrown out of. Like, you'll have fucking like conservatives talking about like liberal men order soy lattes and then get pegged by their girlfriends. They're such, like, you know, faggot tranny cocks, and it's just like, you don't have to go as far as having like heterosexual sex with a woman in the wrong way, but like, yeah, ordering a soy latte, or like there's this one like very quote unquote like lighthearted series of tweets that I saw on Twitter once, where like a woman posted, "Why are you as a man ordering dessert?" And then a guy quote tweeted her and was like, "Fuck this, I'm non-binary now, I cannot deal with this anymore. I want to order dessert, so I'm non-binary. Hell with it." Emasculation, expulsion from the category of man, shockingly, breathtakingly easy. And so once that happens, what is left for you is to be misogynized, to be treated as everything under patriarchy that is not a man, or is a lesser man even, is treated as. Because like that is also how like men discipline each other and themselves within their own social groups and their own little pack hierarchies, right? The worst thing that you can be in a group of men is like the least manly, or the most like a woman, because then you will experience the full force of their misogyny and homophobia and trans misogyny. So the idea that like trans misogyny is like fundamentally rooted more as an oppression of men, and is like, it's a disciplining mechanism. It's about a specific direction. It's about making examples out of certain kinds of people. But it is fundamentally a type of misogyny. It is fundamentally a thing that happens to women. And making that conceptual leap is so hard, especially for cis people, but not even for just cis people, for other queer people, for other trans people even. Just like, so much of the world and so much of patriarchy and so much of queer oppression makes sense when you see that trans women are a type of woman, you know, a particularly degraded, fallen, you know, kind of woman that is treated as reproductive waste. But like through that lens, so much of everything that is wrong with patriarchy just suddenly clicks into place. Because, like, you know, the fact that like this is even possible, the fact that like you can move from this state to another, and the fact that it happens all the time, that it happens over and over in societies all over the world, shows that like we all have this like very fundamental understanding of gender as social, encoded across most culture and history and time. Because you can fail being a man. It doesn't matter if you have the bits. If you don't do it right, you're headed for woman town.
Yeah, and I'm gonna do something that you always love. I'm gonna compare gender to race real quick. Just stay with me.
Okay, lovely. Yeah.
No, okay. People do, like, you've written about this extensively, but like there are a lot of ways to do it disingenuously, and these are ultimately different social constructs.
Mhm.
But what they do have in common is that they are, among other things, labor relationships in which there is an ultimate labor beneficiary, and everyone else is defined by what kind of labor they're supposed to give them and what kind of treatment by them they are afforded, right? And it's man and white people, respectively, right? And what's interesting
Yeah.
to me about this is that, like, and obviously this has to be because it's supposed to be a competitive scarcity kind of relationship. That means that the category, the king among kings, is supposed to be something you can fail out of because it's a category that demands the existence of the laborer. As soon as it stops existing, the king cannot exist without the peasants. And so too, like, if you have a category that is one that's supposed to be receiving labor, then it has to have laborers. It has to have the mechanism to always create more of them. So if you ever look at how Slavic people are treated, when there are brown people in the room, we're white. But as soon as it's only white people in the room, we stop being white. And, like, you know, this is an oversimplification kind of thing, but, like, it's own
like,
voices. Okay, I can speak from experience that, like, when there are people of color to be racist to, we are white, 100% white. As soon as they leave, we replace them immediately, both in terms of, like, being a labor underclass and people who are savages that are uncivilized. Like, it's all the same thing. And it's the same thing with a kind of a cat. Yeah.
Brexit was more about Eastern European people than it was about brown people. Obviously, like, you know, migrant votes and things like that. But a lot of the Brexit propaganda was about Polish immigrants. So yeah, like, it's a social construct. It's a fluid thing.
Right, and it's exactly the same thing with, like, when you have men. While there are women in the room, while there are gender diverse people in the room, all men are men. But the moment there are only men in, like, an all boys school or whatever, they have to find the most feminine one. They can't help it because the category of man is defined by brutalizing, dominating, and extracting.
Oh God,
sexual, domestic, and, well, you can't really extract reproductive, like, labor from a faggot, but, you know, it is defined by
sexual
that extraction.
labor?
Yeah, but sexual labor absolutely is defined by that, and is defined by domination, by feeling and, like, being quote unquote better than them. And so you have to be better than someone, so the someone has to exist. Therefore, the category needs to be easy to fail at.
I'm so glad you said that 1.5 hours into the podcast. Now, all the people who would have gotten mad about it are not here. So great timing. Great timing. Beautiful. Thank you.
Another way of thinking about all this that I've been focused on more and more, so especially my most recent book, Sexed Up, there's also an essay that's online that's, what is it called? It's called Something Penises and Queer and Feminist Purity Politics.
Right.
Where I get into it. So it's basically, it's this idea about stigma. And so we talk about, you know, obviously there's stigmatized groups. We kind of know what that means. If you're a stigmatized group, you might be ostracized or excluded from society or certain aspects of society. And the interesting thing about stigma is that people view it as contagious, or specifically as a contagion, which is this specific kind of construct that a contagion is not just contagious, but even if you slightly touch it, if you touch it at all, it permanently contaminates you. And with regards to sex and sexism, women, kind of like taking from Wittig, you know, women are sex and sex is bad. Sex is stigmatized, which is why sex is dirty. Men are pure. Men can contaminate other people with stigma, for instance, by sexually dominating them, but they themselves are pure. Right. And so if a woman has sex for the first time, she was a virgin and pure, but now she's dirty, she's contaminated, she's used up all these, you know, things that, like, suggest, you know, that she's been permanently contaminated. And I think that that's a part of the reason why, like, you get these weird things with the men, like, you know, is it gay to eat a dessert if you're a man? You know, we're even getting this stuff, like, you know, that, like, some of the really, like, far right people are, like, suggesting that even having a relationship with a woman is, like, then you're no longer a pure man, you're contaminated by women. Like, anything that becomes feminine, if you get contaminated by it, like, you are stigmatized and you're, like, no longer a man, right? And so I think that this is definitely playing a role in all of this stuff, where basically, you know, women are stigmatized, they are sex and sex is bad. But if you fall outside of the man group for whatever reason, or if you can never attain it, you're lumped into this group that's also a stigmatized group. Yeah, so I just think it's I think these
That
ideas, particularly, you were talking about how Nanda couldn't see the fact that the Hijra were being treated like defective women, like fallen women. And I think that some of what's going on here is that because there's this sexist reflex that a lot of cis people have, where if they find out you're trans, they always want to revert to whatever your birth assigned sex is. Which is why if
hmm
you are talking to a cis person and you talk about a friend who's non-binary, they will almost always ask or question about, well, like, are they an AFAB or an AMAB non-binary person? It's like, well, they're
yeah.
non-binary, and so it doesn't matter. But like, they always kind of want to group you with your birth sex, and I think that this is where the problem is because they are thinking of trans people or Hijra in this case as being really men. They can't see the misogyny because in their minds, misogyny is something that happens to women, and it's only
hmm
when you kind of break it down like this, where it becomes really clear that trans people and a lot of, third sex, third gender people in other cultures, or whether it's here in kind of more Western cultures, are lumped into the third sex. We're seen as essentially defective women. And I think that
hmm
that's, true for trans women, but it's also true in different ways for people on the trans masculine spectrum. And I think
hmm
you, Talia, in the third sex, it begins with, I really liked you start out with the binary, right? The ones and zeros.
Yeah.
And well, what happens when you have something that you can't categorize it? Well, you have to categorize it as something, you have to throw it into one group. And it's like, well, we can't call it a one because ones are the very special
hmm
number. They're the important ones. So they get
Yep.
kind of thrown into the zeros, right? And that's
Yep. Yep. Yep.
where a lot of this is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, because like even if you're an error category, if at the end of the day you are forced to think about things in a strict binary in terms of ones and zeros, so like it's sort of like this. We have all of these unstated rules where everyone knows that it's easy to fail at being a man because because like what is the first tool we reach for when we want to shame a man? We effeminize him. We use the language of in brackets transmisogyny usually, but also when it comes down to it, people still have this fixed idea, like, sure, we have a society that like shames men by treating them as women, but like, men can't become women, women can't become men. So it's like it's a contradictory pair of ideas, and like simultaneously trying to hold both of those truths in your mind is how we get a lot of nonsensical discourses, or at least a lot of discourses that miss the point behind what is actually happening. But when I start talking about transmisogyny theory and these terms just building on your ideas and things like that, a lot of people sort of like accused me of being like, are you saying that like, when I'm being called a man by a transphobe, they secretly believe me to be a woman, but are only calling me a man to hurt me? And I'm like, it's not really about what they believe inside their very brain. Because it's like, yeah, someone will call me a man while misogynistically degrading me because they just don't have a schema that allows them to recognize the contradiction between those two things. Like, I have to be a man because despite the fact that I live as a woman, despite the fact that I have changed my sex, despite the fact that I have not been seen or treated as a man for years now, they're like, oh well, if you're a tranny, then you will never be a woman. And if you'll never be a woman, you must be a man. While at the same time being misogynistic towards me, being lesbophobic towards me, treating me as lesser and treating me as hysterical. Like people will do both these things to you at the same time because while we all understand that gender is social, we're all propagandized and taught that gender is also immutable. Carrying both of these truths in our heads is difficult, but most people do it, and that's the sort of like hardest part to communicate and grapple with. And if you're someone who actually understands the mechanisms of all of these things, you're slowly driven crazy. Unfortunately. That's the point of like examining all of these things, all of this like, this long complicated history of third sexes and genderqueer discourses and like trans misogyny at the root of it all, right? Because like ultimately what trans misogyny really is, and I know this is part of our brand, so obviously I have an incentive to say it like this, but I do truly believe it. Trans misogyny theory is like the most powerful like explanatory theory for understanding patriarchy and feminism. And why we are sorted into these sex classes and sex castes and, why there are so many like why there is such investment in all of these things. Like have sometimes cis people who are just like, I don't understand why all of this are important. Like, yeah, let trans people transition or like, whatever, I'm fine with them existing. I don't care. Why is it all important? And like, it is though. Like there's a reason that Republicans poured so much funding, like billions into attack ads about trans people. There's a reason there's like this massive movement that has like fucking like, Pope Benedict the whatever was like obsessed with gender ideology, as he termed it, both like feminism and transition. It started off initially, gender ideology, which is a term that is used to slur the trans movement these days, started off initially as a way to refer to Judith Butler's gender theory and the idea that gender is social and can be changed and crossed and, mutated. And it is something that is like rigidly enforced onto us. And these are very powerful ideas because fundamentally our entire society is organized around these immutable hierarchies. So revealing that these hierarchies are not as infallible and immutable as we all treat them as is incredibly destabilizing for a lot of people who are very invested in them, from like very affluent and powerful and public figures to even private individuals who are very invested in the ideas of being powerful and dominant and having a right and an entitlement to other people's bodies. So unfortunately it's important because uh, everyone is invested in it, whether we know it or acknowledge it.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, on that very somber note, thank you so very much for joining us today, Julia. I really love engaging with your work, and I really love talking to you every time I do it. Especially because, again, the stories from the '90s and the 2000s, they always live up to my expectations. I'll say that.
Well, thanks. And yeah, I was very excited when you invited me on. I really enjoy your podcast. It's essentially the podcast that I can listen to really depressing shit, but made funny.
This is not the
Well,
first time we got this feedback.
Yeah, that is some
Um,
kind praise. Thank you very much.
Before you go, is there anything that you want to plug, or like where people want to find you, or like your blog and stuff like that?
Sure, yeah. Well, my website where you can find everything from is juliaserano.com. And so Serano has one R for people listening. And if you go to my writings page, you can find literally like 20 years of all of my online writings. I'm cross-posting to both Medium and Substack now. You can also check out my YouTube channel, which I've been doing video essays more. And you can actually see one of the video essays is Do Trans People Reinforce Gender, which kind of gets into some of this. It's a reading from my second book, Excluded. And all my books are on my website too. And I'm at Julia Serano at most social media places.
Awesome.
All right, perfect.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you all.
Cracked Ivory is supported by Patreon. Join us at patreon.com/crackedivorypod to receive early access to our episodes as well as full Patreon exclusive episodes and behind the scenes content. Follow Talia Bhatt at taliabhatt.com and Emma Zaharuk at dolphindiaries.card.co for their solo feminist projects. Cracked Ivory is edited by Emma Zaharuk and produced by Talia Bhatt and Emma Zaharuk. All music is by Kevin MacLeod. Special thanks to White Mirror, Lava Monster, Axan.dev, Ceiling Fan, Yana Dunfield, Candy Barber, and Nix Taylor. Thanks for listening.